Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's live video. My name is May Doldelau, and we are doing page 111 from The Alchemists, and that's from the book Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Charles Mackay. And my name is May Doldelau. I live in Waikiki, Hawaii, at our 7-year-old son, Jordan. Back in 2011, I had over $40,000 of credit card debts. I worked at a local bank here in Hawaii, but by April of 2016, paid off all the debt, improved our family's net worth by over $500,000, was making almost $500 a month in passive income, and I quit my job at the bank. December 23rd, 2016 was my last day, and then I started coaching clients to do what I did, which is create passive income, but pay off debt and create more time freedom in your life. The whole 9 yards, just have a better lifestyle. So check out all my products, get a free ebook, Working Parents Guide to Financial Freedom, when you join my email list. Go to yesfinanciallyfree.com, put in your first name, email address. On the right side, hit the big red yes button, and it'll go directly to your inbox. All right? So today we are talking about the alchemists. Alchemists are people who say they can turn lead into gold or any kind of metal into gold, and there's a history of them. Now, this book I'm reading, Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions, goes through the most famous alchemists. Now, it doesn't just do alchemists. This is one chapter of the book. We've already done 3 chapters: the Mississippi Mania, the South Sea Company bubble, and then the Tulipomania, when Holland went nuts for tulips, right? So it's all about how people, they're chased for money, wealth, whatever it is, and what happens, like the madness of crowds and delusions. So it's good to understand human nature when learning about money. One of the most famous books, often quoted and often referred to. So we're going to start on page 111 and continue learning about all these alchemists today. So I'm going to read, and you're free to go to yesfinanciallyfree.com. My blog link, I have links in the blog to the ebook, so you can read along, read it yourself, skim it, go back, enjoy it. It is a free ebook because it was written a long time ago, as you will find as I start reading, and you're like, wow, that is some old English. So here we go. All right, Roger Bacon. The powerful delusion of alchemy seized upon a mind still greater than that of Raymond Lully. Roger Bacon firmly believed in the philosopher's stone and spent much of his life in search of it. His example helped to render all the learned men of the time more convinced of its practicability and more eager in the pursuit. He was born in Ilchester in the county of Somerset in the year 1214. He studied for some time in the University of Oxford and afterwards in that of Paris, in which he received the degree of Doctor of Divinity. Returning to England in 1240, he became a monk of the Order of St. Francis. He was by far the most learned man of his age, and his acquirements were so much above the comprehension of his contemporaries that they could only account for them by supposing that he was indebted for them to the devil. Voltaire has not inaptly designated him de l'or écouté de tout au Dieu de son siècle. But the crust of superstition that enveloped his powerful mind, though it may have dimmed, could not obscure the brightness of his genius. To him, and apparently to him only, among all the inquiring spirits of the time, were known the properties of the concave and convex lenses. He also invented the magic lantern, that pretty plaything of modern days, which acquired for him a reputation that embittered his life. In a history of alchemy, the name of this great man cannot be omitted, although unlike many others of whom we shall have occasion to speak, he only made it secondary to other pursuits. The love of universal knowledge that filled his mind will not allow him to neglect one branch of science, of which neither he nor the world could yet see the absurdity. He made ample amends for his time lost in this pursuit by his knowledge in physics and his acquaintance with astronomy. The telescope, burning glasses, and gunpowder are discoveries which may well carry his fame to the remotest time, and make the world blind to the one spot of folly, the diagnosis of the age in which he lived, and the circumstances by which he was surrounded. His treatise on the admirable power of art and nature and the production of the philosopher's stone was translated into French by Gerard de Tormes and published at Lyon in 1557. His Mirror of Alchemy was also published in France in the same year, in Paris in 1612, with some additions from the works of Raymond Lully. A complete list of all the published treatises upon the subject may be seen in L'Anglet de Fresnoy. Pope John the 22nd. This prelate is said to have been the friend and pupil of Arnold de Villeneuve, by whom he was instructed in all secrets of alchemy. Tradition asserts of him that he made great quantities of gold and died as rich as Croesus. He was born in Cahors in the province of Gien in the year 1244. He was a very eloquent preacher and soon reached high dignity in the church. He wrote a work on the transmutation of metals and had a famous laboratory in Avignon. He issued 2 bulls against the numerous pretenders to the art, who had sprung up in every part of Christendom, from which it might be inferred that he was himself free from the delusion. The alchemists claim him, however, as one of the most distinguished and successful professors of their art, and say that his bulls were not directed against the real adepts, but false pretenders. They lay particular stress upon these words in his bull. Spondent ca no exhibant divitiam pauperes alchymiste. It is clear, they say, relate only to poor alchemists, and therefore false ones. He died in the year 1344, leaving in his coffers a sum of 18 millions of florins. Popular belief alleged that he had made and not amassed this treasure, and alchemists complacently cite this as a proof that the philosopher's stone was not such a chimera as the incredulous pretended. They take it for granted that John really left this money and asked by what possible means he could have accumulated it. Replying to their own question, they said triumphantly, his book shews it was all by alchemy, the secrets of which he learned from Arnold de Villeneuve and Raymond Lully. But he was as prudent as all other hermetic philosophers. Whoever would read his book to find out his secret would employ all his labor in vain. The Pope took good care not to divulge it. Unluckily for their own credit, all these gold makers are in the same predicament. Their great secret loses its worth most wonderfully in the telling, and therefore they keep it snugly to themselves. Perhaps they thought that if everybody could transmute metals, gold would be so plentiful that it would be no longer valuable, that some sort of new art would be requisite to transmute it back again into steel and iron. So society is much indebted to them for their forbearance. Jean de Meung. All classes of men dabbled in the art at this time. The last mentioned was a pope. The one of whom we now speak of was a poet. Jean de Meung, the celebrated author of Roman de la Rose, was born in the year 1279 and 1280, and was a great personage of the courts of Louis X, Philip the Long, Charles IX, and Philip de Valois. His famous poem of the Roman de la Rose, which treats of every subject in vogue at that day, necessarily makes great mention of alchemy. Jean was a firm believer in the art, and wrote, besides his Roman, 2 shorter poems, one entitled The Remonstrance of Nature to the Wandering Alchemist, and The Reply of the Alchemist to Nature. Poetry and alchemy were his delight, and priests and women were his abomination. Pleasant stories related of him and the ladies of the court of Charles IX. He had written the following libellous couplet upon the fair sex. Tout serait ou fut, du fait ou de volonté putain, et qui très bien vous chercherez, tout putain vous trouverez. This naturally gave great offense, and being perceived one day in the king's antechamber by some ladies who were waiting for an audience, they resolved to punish him. To the number of 10 or 12, they armed themselves with canes and rods and surrounded the unlucky poet, called upon the gentleman to present to strip naked, and they might wreak just vengeance upon him and lash him through the streets of the town. Some of the lords present were in no wise loath, and promised themselves great sport from his punishment. But Jean de Meung was unmoved by their threats, and stood up calmly in the midst of them, begging them to hear him first. And then, if not satisfied, they might do as they liked with him. Silence being restored, he stood upon a chair and entered in his defense. He acknowledged that he was the author of the obnoxious verses, but denied that they bore reference to all womankind. He only mentioned to speak of the vicious and abandoned, whereas those women he saw around him were patterns of virtue, loveliness, and modesty. If, however, any lady present thought herself aggrieved, he would consent to be stripped, and she might lash him till her arms were wearied. It is added that by this means Jean escaped his flogging, and that the wrath of the fair ones immediately subsided. The gentlemen present were, however, of opinion that if every lady in the room whose character corresponded with the verses had taken him at his word, the poet would in all probability have been beaten to death. All his life long he evinced a great animosity toward the priesthood, and his famous poem abounds with the passage reflecting upon their avarice, cruelty, and immorality. At his death, he left a large box filled with some weighty material, which he bequeathed to the Cordeliers as a peace offering for the abuse he had lavished upon them. As his practice of alchemy was well known, it was thought that the box was filled with gold and silver, and the Cordeliers congratulated each other on their rich acquisition. When it came to be opened, they found to their horror that it was filled only with slates, scratched with hieroglyphic and Kabbalistic characters. Indignant at the insult, they determined to refuse him Christian burial on pretense that he was a sorcerer. He was, however, honorably buried in Paris, the whole court attending his funeral. Nicolas Flamel. The story of this alchemist, as handed down by tradition and enshrined in the pages of Lenglet de Fresnoy, is not a little marvelous. He was born in Pontoise of a poor but respectable family at the end of the 13th or beginning of the 14th century. Having no patrimony, he set out for Paris at an early age to try his fortune as a public scribe. He had received a good education, was well skilled in the learned languages, and was an excellent penman. He soon procured occupation as a letter writer and copyist, and used to sit at the corner of the Rue de Marivaux, practice his calling, but he hardly made profit enough to keep body and soul together. To mend his fortunes, he tried poetry, but this was a more wretched occupation still. As a transcriber, he had at least gained bread and cheese, and his rhymes were not worth a crust. He then tried painting with little success, and as a last resort began to search for the philosopher's stone and tell fortunes. This was a happier idea. He soon increased in substance and had wherewithal to live comfortably. He therefore took upon himself his wife Petronella and began to save money, but continued to all outward appearance as poor and miserable as before. In the course of a few years, he became desperately addicted to the study of alchemy, and thought of nothing but the philosopher's stones, the elixir of life, and the universal alkahest. In the year 1257, he bought by chance an old book for 2 florins, which soon became his sole study. It was written with a steel instrument upon the bark of trees, and contained 21, or as he himself expressed it, 3 times 7 leaves. The writing was very elegant and in the Latin language. Each 7th leaf contained a picture and no writing. On the first of these was a serpent swallowing rods, on the second a cross with a serpent crucified, and on the third the representation of a desert, in the midst of which was a fortune, with serpents crawling from side to side. Purported to be written by no less a personage than Abraham, patriarch Jew, prince, philosopher, priest, Levite, and astrologer, and invoked curses upon anyone who should cast eyes upon it without being a sacrificer of a scribe. Nicolas Flamel never thought it extraordinary that Abraham should have known Latin, and was convinced that the characters on his book had been traced by the hands of that great patriarch himself. He was at first afraid to read it after he became aware of the curse it contained, but he got over that difficulty by recollecting that although he was not a sacrificer, he had practiced as a scribe. As he read, he was filled with admiration and found that it was a perfect treatise upon the transmutation of metals. All the processes were clearly explained, the vessels, the retorts, the mixtures, and the proper times and seasons for experiment. But, as ill luck would have it, the possession of the philosopher's stone, or prime agent in the work, was presupposed. This was difficulty which was not to be got over. It was like telling a starving man how to cook a beefsteak instead of giving him the money to buy one. But Nicholas did not despair, and set out studying the hieroglyphics and allegorical representations with which the book abounded. He soon convinced himself that it had been one of the sacred books of the Jews, and that it was taken from the Temple of Jerusalem on its destruction by Titus. The process of reasoning by which he arrived at this conclusion is not stated. From some expressions in the treatise, he learned that the allegorical drawings on the 4th and 5th leaves enshrine the secret of the philosopher's stone, without which all the fine Latin of the directions was utterly unavailing. He invited all the alchemists and learned men of Paris to come and examine them, but they all departed as wise as they came. Nobody could make anything neither of Nicholas or his pictures, and some even went so far to say that his invaluable book was not worth a farthing. This was not to be borne, and Nicholas resolved to discover the great secret by himself, without troubling the philosophers. He found on the first page of the 4th leaf the picture of Mercury attacked by an old man resembling Saturn or Time. The latter had an hourglass on his hand, and in his hand a scythe, with which he aimed a blow at Mercury's feet. The reverse of the leaf represented a flower growing on a mountain top, shaken rudely by the wind, with a blue stalk, red and white blossoms, and leaves of pure gold. Around it were a number of dragons and griffins. On the 5th page of the 5th leaf, first page of the 5th leaf was a fine garden, in the midst of which was a rose tree in full bloom, supported against the trunk of a gigantic oak. At the 4th At the foot of this there was bubbled up a fountain of milk-white water, which, forming a small stream, flowed through the garden and was afterwards lost in the sands. On the second page was a king with a sword in his hand, superintending a number of soldiers, who, in execution of his orders, were killing a great multitude of young children, spurning the prayers and tears of their mothers, who tried to save them from destruction. The blood of the children was carefully collected by another party of soldiers and put in a large vessel, in which two allegorical pillars of the sun and moon were bathing themselves. Jeez. For 21 years, poor Nicholas wearied himself with the study of these pictures, but still could make nothing of them. His wife, Petronella, at last persuaded him to find out some learned rabbi, but there was no rabbi in Paris learned enough to be of any service to him. The Jews met but small encouragement to fix their abode in France, and all the chiefs of that people were located in Spain. To Spain, accordingly, Nicholas Flamel repaired. He left his book in Paris for fear, perhaps, that he might be robbed of it on the road, and telling his neighbors that he was going on a pilgrimage to the shrine of St. James of Compostela. He trudged on foot towards Madrid in search of a rabbi. He was absent 2 years in that country and made himself known to a great number of Jews, descendants of those who had been expelled from France in the reign of Philip Augustus. Believers of the Philosopher's Stone give the following account of his adventure. They say that at Lyon, he made the acquaintance of a converted Jew named Cauchus, a very learned philosopher, to whom he explained the title and nature of his little book. The doctor was transported with joy as soon as he heard it named, and immediately resolved to accompany Nicholas to Paris, that he might have a sight of it. The two set out together, the doctor on the way entertaining his companion with the history of his book, which, the genuine book he thought it be, from the description he had heard of it, was in the handwriting of Abraham himself, and had been in the possession of a person who was no less distinguished than Moses, Joshua, Solomon, and Esdras. It contained all the secrets of alchemy and many other sciences, and was the most valuable book that had ever existed in this world. The doctor was himself no mean adept, and Nicholas profited greatly by his discourse, as in the garb of poor pilgrims they wended their way to Paris, convinced of their power to turn every old shovel in that capital into pure gold. But unfortunately, when they reached Orleans, the doctor was taken dangerously ill. Nicholas watched by his bedside and acted the double part of a physician and nursed him, but he died after a few days, lamenting with his last breath that he never lived long enough to see the precious volume. Nicholas rendered the last honors to his body with a sorrowful heart, and not one sou in his pocket, proceeded home to his wife Petronella. He immediately recommended the study of his pictures, but for 2 whole years he was as far from understanding them as ever. At last, in the 3rd year, a glimmer of light stole over his understanding. He recalled some expansion of his friend the doctor, which had hitherto escaped his memory, and he found that all his previous experience had been conducted on a wrong basis. He recommended them now with renewed energy. At the end of the year, had the satisfaction to see his toils rewarded. On the 13th January 1382, says Lenglet, he made a projection on Mercury and had some very excellent silver. On the 25th April following, he converted a large quantity of mercury into gold, and the great secret was his. Nicholas was now about 80 years of age and still a hale and stout old man. His friends say that by a simultaneous discovery of the elixir of life, he found means to keep death at a distance for another quarter of a century, that he died in 1415 at the age of 116. In this interval, he made immense quantities of gold, though to all outward appearance he was poor as a mouse. At the early period of his changed fortune, he had, like a worthy man, taken counsel with his old wife Petronella as to the best use he could make of his wealth. Petronella replied that, as unfortunately they had no children, the best thing he could do was to build hospitals and endow churches. Nicholas thought so too, especially when he began to find that his elixir could not keep off death, and that the grim foe was making rapid advances upon him. Richly endowed the church of Saint Jacques de la Boucherie near the Rue de Marivaux, where he had all his life resided, besides 7 others in different parts of the kingdom. He also endowed 14 hospitals and built 3 chapels. The fame of his great wealth and his munificent benefactions soon spread over all the country, and he was visited, among others, by the celebrated doctors of that day, Jean Garcin, Jean de Courtecuisse, and Pierre de Dailly. They found him in his humble apartment, meanly clad, and eating porridge out of an earthen vessel, and with regard to his secret, as impenetrable as all his predecessors in alchemy. His fame reached the ears of the king, Charles VI, who sent Monsieur de Cramoisi, the master of requests, to find out whether Nicholas had indeed discovered the Philosopher's Stone. But Monsieur de Cramoisi took nothing by his visit. All his attempts to sound the alchemist were unavailing, and he returned to his royal master no wiser than he came. It was in this year, 1414, that he lost his faithful Petronella. He did not long survive her, but died in the following year and was buried with great pomp by the grateful priest of Saint Jacques de la Boucherie. The great wealth of Nicolas Flamel is undoubted, as the records of several churches and hospitals in France can testify. That he practiced alchemy is equally certain, as he left behind several works upon the subject. Those who knew him well and who were incredulous about the philosopher's stone give a satisfactory solution to the secret of his wealth. They say that he was always a miser and a usurer, that his journey to Spain was undertaken with very different motives from those pretended by the alchemists, that in fact he went to collect debts due from Jews in that country to their brethren in Paris, and that he charged commission of fully cent per cent, consideration of the difficulty of collecting and the dangers on the road, that when he possessed thousands he lived upon almost nothing, and was the general money lender at enormous profits to all the dissipated young men in the French court. Among the works written by Nicolas Flamel on the subject of alchemy is a philosophic summary poem reprinted in 1735 as an appendix to the third volume of the Roman de la Rose. He also wrote 3 treatises upon natural philosophy and an alchemic allegory entitled Le Désir Désiré. Specimens of his writing and a facsimile of the drawings in his work in Book of Abraham may be seen in Salmon's Bibliothèque des Philosophiques Chimiques. The writer of the article Flamel in the Biographie Universelle says that for 100 years after the death of Flamel, many of the adepts believed that he was still alive and that he would live for upwards of 600 years. The house he formerly occupied at the corner of Rue de Marivaux has been often taken by credulous spectators and ransacked from top to bottom in the hopes that gold might be found. The report was current in Paris not long previous to the year 1816 that some lodgers had found in the cellars several jars filled with a dark-colored ponderous matter. Upon the strength of the rumor, a believer in all the wondrous tales told of Nicolas Flamel bought the house and nearly pulled it to pieces in ransacking the walls and wainscoting for hidden gold. He got nothing for his pains, however, and had a heavy bill to restore his dilapidations. We're going to end here, and then we're going to start with George Ripley on the next reading. Have a great weekend. Thank you so much for being on the live. Share this with your friends and followers. I'm so grateful to all of those on YouTube. Please subscribe to the channel. Share this with your friends and followers, and I'll see you again on Monday. But check out the blog for all the summaries and all the information that I haven't mentioned. And